Thank you very much, Vimalin. Thank you all. Good morning, everybody. I'm trying to keep myself strictly to time here. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Vimalin and everybody else involved in the organization of this wonderful conference. I was a bit anxious about finding myself in a predominantly architectural group, but Del Upton's talk reassured me that some of you, and he in particular, are really anthropologists in disguise. And anthropology itself, of course, has moved much more towards the kind of spatial analysis that he was talking about at the end of his address. But what I'm going to do is to try to discommode some very familiar ideas about what we mean when we talk about culture. You've already seen some of my responses on this subject, and I'm going to try to make it a little bit more explicit. Like Del, I'm going to move outside China. In fact, I'm going to move entirely outside China, because although now I am actively interested in the anthropology of China, I am certainly in no sense a specialist, and I think I can talk more effectively about places I do know, including one I saw very familiarly on the screen, which of course was a scene from Athens, a city where I've lived for many, many years. But let me begin with some general principles. So first of all, the idea that you can have something called vernacular architecture that is separate from the social context that produces it is, for me, a very dangerous notion. I don't think you can have vernacular architecture without people. If you do, those people are still there as ghosts. They're dead people, but they're still there. And I'm not even sure if any architecture at all is ever not vernacular. In one of the things that gave Del Upton's identity as an anthropologist away is his insistence, which I totally share, that there's no real distinction usefully to be made between high culture and low culture. In fact, no self-respecting anthropologist would be caught dead using that distinction these days. Now, of course, a great deal of the work that is done in planning, and I should tell you, by the way, that these days we're also looking at planners, architects, and even anthropologists anthropologically. We're studying their lives and want to understand how the way they live affects the way they think about how the rest of the world should live. But bureaucrats in most countries are very badly equipped to deal with the realities of social life. They are trained to process paper, they are trained to avoid responsibility, they are trained to cover for each other, and above all, they are trained to present everything they do as strict obedience to the law. Of course, every bureaucrat will tell you in private moments that when you have to apply the law, you're also interpreting it, and so there's actually a lot more flexibility under the surface than you realize. But the training does not include practical training for dealing with the problems, for example, of living in a slum. How many bureaucrats in city administrations have been forced to spend 2 or 3 months living in the kind of communities that they would like to destroy, evict? How many of them have done that? None. I have repeatedly said in Thailand, in Bangkok, where I've been dealing with a particularly intransigent bureaucracy, as you will see a bit later on, a very good form of training for the bureaucrats in the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration would be to require them to live for a month or two in one of the slums. They would then learn 2 things. They would learn that slum dwellers are real people, just as intelligent, just as gifted, but perhaps a little less fortunate than they are themselves. And they would also learn the value of human dignity. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, when people do move, and there's a lot of migration going on in the world today, China, of course, is an excellent example of that, they bring new forms of knowledge as they move. Something like 80% of today's urban dwellers are actually recent rural to urban migrants. What this means is that we cannot really talk about a separate urban anthropology. Some people like to talk about urban anthropology. I talk about doing ethnography in urban spaces. And this is my gesture perhaps back towards planners. Let's not simply set up a hard and fast distinction, urban versus rural. Let us understand that most people living in cities bring rural knowledge. But as I said yesterday, that knowledge is not just about how to build a house or how to live in a house. It's also about kinship, neighborhood, concepts of obligation, reciprocity, hospitality, and so on. Obviously, some things change when you live in a city. And for the anthropologists, they change too. If you're working in a village, you don't need to phone up and make an appointment. You just go to the local tea house or coffee house and meet your friends and hang out. Which is why, by the way, I always say to Chinese audiences that anthropology should be renamed from being renlei shui to being bagua shui, because we spend a lot of time doing bagua, and that's actually when we find out most of the really interesting things. And finally, if we're going to advise people on policy, the other 3 points are vitally important. We have to understand that people who are charged with managing life in a city are not necessarily very well prepared to do it. So, train the bureaucrats, have them live in the kinds of places where they want to make changes, have the planners do what anthropologists do, live in those kinds of places. Even if just for a couple of weeks, it would change their attitude completely, and it would give them deep respect, I think, for the people who live there. And above all, make them understand that until you know about social structure, social relationships, and values, you can't really understand why somebody, for example, who's just moved in from a village doesn't understand what a bathtub is for, to take a very famous example. Now, for example, this diagram, which is very indistinct, is taken from the article that I mentioned yesterday by a South African anthropologist and an Indian architect. And they were asking the question, when people came in from the countryside in what is now Turkey and came to live in a Greek city, what happened? Why did they build onto the existing structures in a particular way? And I pointed out, and I repeat again today, that what they were looking at was a system of dowry presentation. And what we mean by that is the daughter in this particular society always gets a house when she gets married. And that dowry, that house, which is part of the dowry, part of what the daughter receives, is supposed to be in a cluster of spaces owned by or controlled by a group of sisters. First her mother, their mother, and her sisters, and then the next generation of sisters. So this means they want to be close together because then they can operate as a family unit. And in addition, each husband is going to insist on an autonomous household, which means that each one of those sisters, now becoming a wife, has to have her own kitchen. Result, you build up and you build down. Okay. And that means that if you're in a cramped urban space, you can only build up and down, you can't build sideways. Now, city planners said these are all illegal buildings. But they couldn't get rid of them without creating an enormous social problem, because what they would have ended up with is a lot of homeless people. And in some countries, France I think is a good example of this, illegally constructed housing is very quickly demolished. In other countries, Italy being a good example, the authorities try to compromise by retrospectively rewriting the rules so that people will be allowed to stay while the conditions of life are improved. I personally prefer the second solution because it seems to me that it demonstrates more sensitivity to the social issues, even if it is not perfectly enforced. Now, we've said before that there's no such thing as a culture, and I'd like to put it up in, I hope, what is reasonably good Chinese. Culture is not a thing, it's a process. A very important distinction. If you go into a national museum, culture is presented to you as a thing, or as a set of things, objects, right? And you get the impression that nothing moves, nothing changes. But actually, rather than talking about cultures, if we talk about culture as the property of all human beings, that is what they learn from one generation to the next, it is a process. It is always moving. And to talk about Chinese culture is usually just an excuse. So when Chinese friends say to me, I couldn't do that, my culture doesn't allow me to do that, I say, you're hiding your agency. You're not seeing that you're just using your culture as an excuse for a certain course of action. Now, the Greek example, and Del has already said a few things about Greece, is a very interesting case because when we talk about Greece, by the way, I don't think there's any other country in the world that has to add the word modern to itself in order to remind you that there are living people there. But we keep having to say modern Greece because otherwise people assume we mean ancient Greece. Actually, we know relatively little about what ancient Greece was really like, because the image that we call ancient Greece is an 18th century German reconstruction of 5th century BC Athens. I'll repeat that. Most of what we understand ancient Greece to be, at least in the popular imagination, and the image of Greece that is put forward by, for example, the National Tourist Organization of Greece, is an 18th century German reconstruction of 5th century BC Athens, which was a very small part of the Greek-speaking world. So in that sense, it's an invented entity. But then all cultures are invented. What happened with Greece, however, was that these poor modern Greeks, as they have to call themselves, were forced to live up to an image of their culture that was not invented by them. It was very largely recreated by Germans and later by British and French philologists and art historians. And then the bourgeoisie became the vehicle. Nationalisms are almost always bourgeois ideologies. The bourgeoisie, as a well-educated part of the population, began to recycle all of these ideas about the classical past, about the ancient past, and to say, this is the image that we have to live up to. It's a terrible tragedy, because it meant that they removed from their culture everything they could that looked as if it might be Turkish, or Arabic, or Slavic, or Albanian, or Romanian, or almost anything else. Italian, that was sort of okay, because that was another classical country. But that was about it. French, well, you'll see in a moment. So everything that was deemed by foreigners to be foreign to Greece was removed. Imagine doing that in China. And yet every country, at some level, has gone through something like this. But Greece is a very extreme example. Now, I don't know quite what happened to the inscription here, but the statement, Greece, I simply want to say, Greece, Byron, the famous Lord Byron, said, Greece, fair Greece, sad relic of departed worth. This was the attitude that the West had to Greece. And this was the only Greece that they really were interested in. And you see it's still being reconstructed. This is a very recent photograph, the Parthenon on the Acropolis. This is an older photograph of the Erechtheum, another of the Acropolis monuments. And this is a photograph of a 19th century bourgeois house in Pirea, the port city of Athens. And you see it's the same design. These caryatids, as they're called, were taken from the religious architecture of 5th century BC Athens and made to be a symbol of high culture. Notice the assumption of high culture for a middle-class family in the port city. This, I think, is an interesting statement. This is a neoclassical house. Again, many of the houses that were built in the 19th century were built to this model of the ancient world. And you see, these are ordinary houses. So now we start to have a big problem, because if the model is coming from these people who said, this is your culture, this is high culture, it's nevertheless being copied in various ways by ordinary people. Is it vernacular or not? My answer is that everybody is ordinary. Even planners and architects are real people. Unless you want to deny that, you would then have to face the consequence of saying that, which is that we have to treat all of this in the same framework. And what happens with the harking back to the ancient past that never really existed in this form is that we have to get these extraordinary convolutions of thinking. That Greek statement, apokatastasi diatiriteu ktiriou, means literally restoration to its ideal form of a building that is to be preserved. Think about the implications of that. It's a completely circular argument. We know what the ancient past looked like, therefore we can copy it. Because we can copy it, we know what it looked like. It's a completely circular way of thinking. And what you see here is the further development of the same design. You saw a few of these in Dell's slideshow as well. This is a hairdressing salon in a provincial town on Crete. And notice, classical sculpture, nothing to do with Crete. This is, again, general Greek culture. The architrave over the top, which is obviously meant to be a very simple imitation of a classical theme. The inscription in Greek komotiri, which just means hairdresser, and just to make sure that you understand this is high culture, yes, it's there in French. Coiffure, because for the Greeks in the 18th and 19th century, anything they imitated in France was okay, because after all, the French claimed to have the highest culture in Europe, but they must have stolen it from us, so now it's our turn to take it back. The Greeks were victims of an ideology that turned them into cultural thieves. Now, there's another kind of architecture that nobody ever talks about. In the same city where you saw that hairdressing salon, which, by the way, the old town is mostly a group of very old buildings from the 14th to the 18th century, the town of Rethymno on Crete, one of the best preserved examples of colonial Venetian architecture anywhere, so we could treat it as a wonderful illustration of domestic, therefore vernacular architecture with a few monuments. I prefer to see it as a complex in which you have a variety of different forms of architectural development, and one of them is this very simple theming design that is made by taking an aluminium comb and moving it through plaster on the surface. This is the facing of houses for people who were too poor to be able to buy expensive tiles or paint. So they simply took a comb and made these designs. When I went to see the director of the Archaeological Service, who was concerned with the conservation rules, I said, you should preserve a few of these. Right? She said, they're not particularly pleasing aesthetically. Now, whose standards of aesthetics was she invoking? Certainly not those of the people who lived there, who said, one of them said to me, the wavy lines are our blood running in the walls. We built these walls with our own hands. Many of us were injured when we were building because we didn't have the right kind of tools, we didn't have the right kind of supervision, but we built those houses because it was all we could do. And I say that in a world that recognizes people of all social classes as equal, should not these be equally part of any restoration or conservation effort as the most impressive church or mosque or temple? I believe that some of these should have been preserved. They have been, but by accident, not by design, including this one, which is more, and some of them become very, very elaborate. Now, states tend to go the other way. They tend to push all of that sort of thing aside and say, those are ugly, those are, as I say, not particularly pleasing aesthetically, and instead to create images of what they think should represent the ideals of the nation state. And this is why we get so many theme parks. So we get First of all, the idea of glorifying the national culture and the power of the state. Maybe some religious or historical event. But what they do is then set an example of something that is so perfectly clean and such a perfect replica that very often the real places, which are still in use, look rather shabby by comparison. I want to say again, there is no such thing as superior or inferior culture. There is only culture as a process, as the product of human life, knowledge, and knowledge transmission. So, I'm sorry, there seems to be something wrong with the way that this is transferred, because it was actually quite legible in my original version. Let's take this example anyway of Kyrgyzstan. When Kyrgyzstan became an independent country, its rulers preached the importance of conserving tradition, whatever tradition was, and make that very clear, and especially of preserving harmony among all the religions. Now, Kyrgyzstan is predominantly an Islamic country, but it also has many people who are self-professed atheists. After all, it was part of the Soviet Union for a very long time. It has some Christians of various kinds, a small community of Jews, and a few Buddhists, mostly Koreans, who came there many, many years ago. One of the most characteristic architectural forms now is the mosque, and you notice this is very cheap material. This is just tin, which can be put up very quickly. And I took a whole series of photographs of these. I'm not going to show you very many, but just those two will give you a sense that there is a pattern here, that there is something that is quite recognizably local. These do not look like mosques you would see in Turkey or in Malaysia or in an Arab country, for example. And what is distinctive about them is those tin roofs. Now, I am sure that as the country becomes more prosperous, those tin roofs will be the first things to go, because people are going to say they're not particularly aesthetically pleasing because it's cheap material, and therefore it's not so likely to get respect. And I would argue, especially having made a collection of photographs of these mosques, that actually, if you're looking for a morphology of the Kyrgyz mosque, first of all, they're a very interesting set, but that they have an aesthetic appeal that you can only understand by looking at a whole series of them. What happens instead is that grandiose leaders of the national cultural effort try to monumentalize culture in a form that blends Kyrgyz styles, no longer very recognizable as such, with the pan-Islamic, basically Arab-derived architecture. And so this is the result. And just to make quite clear that we know what's going on, a religious inscription in Arabic. But there is a theme park in Kyrgyzstan, and in it you will find replicas of every religious type of building. There's a mosque, there's a church, there's a synagogue, I think actually 2 or 3 different churches, and there is also reconstruction of the older pre-Islamic pagan forms of worship. People are greeted on arrival by young women dressed in Kyrgyz costume in a form that you will never see them wearing very much on the streets anymore. The only thing you do sometimes see is the typical Kyrgyz hat, and you'll see that in the countryside. But what is going on here is a complete reconstruction, not just of the buildings, but of a way of life. Now, I want, in most of the time left to me, to talk about a community in Thailand, in Bangkok, that really does want to do something like this. It wants to be, as they say, a living museum, but it's not being allowed to do so. And I want to raise the question, first of all, why isn't it being allowed to do so, and what lessons can we learn from this? I'm speaking, as Wimalin will certainly recognize, and she's been there, of the small community of Pamahakan, which is located in Old Bangkok and is now in about the 25th year of its struggle against the city hall against eviction. And ironically, in the week virtually in which my book finally came out about this community, the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration has once again said, we are going to clear out the community. I can assure you that if sometimes I seem a little tired, it's because I'm up half the night emailing with various people trying to organize some kind of critical resistance. I'm not trying to say that the people in Pemahakan are all angels. What I'm trying to say is that they are human beings with the same right to human dignity as everyone else, and that they have made a much better case for staying in the place where they live than the authorities have made for kicking them out, even though legally the authorities are perfectly in the right. So, to understand this, we have to think about the nature of the Thai society. Old Siam, as it used to be called, was what in Thai still to this day is called a Mueang. A Mueang is basically a moral community. The word is often translated as city or town, but it really means a place or a space that is quite flexible. So you can use the word Mueang of a small village, of a big city, or of the entire country. When Thais speak about Thailand, informally, they call it Mueang Thai. When they speak of it as a nation state, as a bureaucratic state, they call it Pratet Thai. And Pratet is the word for nation state that is basically modeled on the European type of nation state that Siam was forced to imitate in the 19th century. The Mueang is based on the principle of the mandala. And what you see, this is unfortunately not very clear. This is Ayutthaya, the previous capital of Thailand, and of Siam, as it was then. I put in the this diagram because you can see very clearly there's a wall with, this actually is called Pranakon. It's the same name as the corresponding part of the wall in Bangkok, because the mandala, which is the cosmic design of the world as understood in the Buddhist cosmology, is of course infinitely reproducible. It's a very simple design of concentric circles with in the middle a single point, which is the phallic symbol representing the generative power, represented usually also by the king. And the Mueang is, in this sense, the mandala is infinitely reproducible. Architects would recognize it as a modular design. And it's a very effective modular design. You find it all over Southeast Asia. If some of you may be familiar with the archaeological site at Borobudur, which if you look down on it is exactly in the shape of a mandala with that same symbol in the middle. This is the fortress at Pemahakan, next to which the people live. And I gave you this photograph because you can see how difficult it is to get up onto this pavement here, up to this sidewalk. There is a physical break between the old mandala wall and the street. It was the first major street built in Bangkok in the reign of Rama V that broke through the mandala but maintained the same orientation to the northeast, the symbolic orientation, was a way of saying we are no longer a shifting Mueang that can expand and contract according to the power of the king at the center. The power of the king is now absolute, and the outer regions of the country are our national boundaries. That was an imitation of the Western concept of the nation state. That's the Pratet. This is the point exactly at which the Mueang and the Pratet crashed into each other. That was a rather appropriate gesture to make under the circumstances. So, Pemahakan is a story of shrines, temples, and ancient houses. So we see shrines like this and very domestic shrines. Now the residents of Pemahakan are saying, because the BMA says, when we come in, we're going to destroy everything except a few of the very oldest houses. We are going to break down these spirit shrines because they're not relevant to us. The response of the people in Pemahakan is to say, we are not going to, we don't worship these shrines because they're our ancestors. we are taking the responsibility of looking after the shrines of those people who lived here before we came here and who were in fact royal bureaucrats. So they know the history of the place very well. They are not claiming to be the original inhabitants. They are claiming instead that this is a place for which they have assumed responsibility, and they would like to be the people who will look after the monument, because it's become very clear that the people in the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration do not have the means to do it. This was the shrine of the whole community. It was then removed. Now this is something else again, and I want to illustrate a principle that's very important here. This is a temple that is known as the city pillar. That is the phallic symbol in the middle of the mandala. So this is the original center of the mandala of Bangkok, and it is still a place where government ministers, for example, will go to pray when they are looking for inspiration. This is a capitalist version of the same building. And again, you see this modular logic, right? The reproduction of the same form over and over again. Let me give you another one. This is the famous Erawan shrine of Brahma, and this is again a shrine put up in front of a major mega store. This is a reproduction of the same shrine in a place called Ban Mo, which is actually where I plan to do my next research project. And this one is here in China. It's in Shanghai. The owner of the big mega store behind it is the owner also of Erawan. So the modular logic of the mandala somehow survives even in the modern nation state, and it's especially clear in the organization of religious space. Back to Bomahakam, the residents are taking very good care of the space, and here you see they are getting ready to put a special kind of paving where they work. This is the plan that an architect drew up for what the community would look like if they were allowed to stay. This is the community president making a lantern that is going to be part of the decoration of, and I just want to give you the sense these people really know what they're doing when they say they're looking after the community. Sorry. This, on the other hand, is what the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration has achieved. They want to replace the whole community with a lawn, a big lawn. Okay? And they cleared out a few of the houses in the front area, and they put the lawn in. 3 years later, roughly, this is what we see. Isn't it clear that the people in Bomahakam could do a much better job than the authorities in looking after this space? This is a disgrace. And nobody in official quarters is admitting what a disgrace it is. Here we're back in the community. You see the lanterns that I showed you being made. This is a community that looks after itself. It has handicrafts. They make bird cages, which have something to do with the southern Thai culture. They have performances of like, which is a kind of dance, drama performance that was actually first performed in Bangkok on this site, and they managed to find the historical documentation to prove that. Now, the authorities are simply celebrating the monumental space. So they have a sign up that is showing you the details of the history of the fort that was constructed very soon after Rama I put the whole wall up in 1782. Inside the community, we have a parodic version of the same thing. This is a sign about gold smelting. Because if you look at this sign, you would never know from the sign that there were real living people there. This is planning at its worst. This is what my former student and colleague Jennifer Mack calls planning from below. This is planning by people themselves. Having learned how to make these kinds of signs, they say this is a sign, and unfortunately it got rather damaged, but it's a sign pointing to a local industry in which people were smelting gold. What they would do is, when goldsmiths make gold objects, there's always some residue. They take the so-called slag from the previous line of melting and reprocess it in order to extract a little more gold from it. And then they sell the gold back to the jewelers mostly actually in the Bangkok Chinatown in Yaowarat. So What you can see here is that the community has an interest in itself as a place of people. The administration only has an interest in monumentality. Now, of course, in order to meet the officials halfway, the residents also have to show the same skill at reifying themselves. So this is a sign that says essentially the pavilion of local knowledge of the community. And it has a lot of, it's like a little version of the National Museum, but inside there are documentations of many kinds showing the history of their struggle against the authorities. It's very different from what you would find in a museum. Finally, the houses themselves. There are 7 old houses that are beautiful examples of what everyone agrees is vernacular architecture. And they are beautiful aesthetically. And to revert, I think, to my discussion with Pietro yesterday, I think that if we think they're beautiful, that is a reason, one reason among many, to preserve them. But I also agree that these are a form of memory, and as such, they conserve information of many different kinds for many different people. What is interesting is that in reifying their own cultural existence, the residents have managed to do this. They have used the language of archaeology, ancient house, Ban Boran, and they put it up in English with a rough date, an approximate date on it as well. Now, you might say, isn't it a bit cynical? They're playing the game of the authorities. The authorities are forcing them into the logic of monumentality. The only way they can fight back and make a convincing case for their existence is by playing this game of, we too have a culture, it's part of the national culture, and as a Hmong, we are a microcosm, a small version of that larger Hmong called Hmong Thai, Thailand, right? So we are this smaller version. We have bird cages representing the south. We produce food representing almost every part of Thailand. We have Like, which is a central Thai dance drama idiom, and so on. So we are like Thailand as a country. We have a little bit of everything. The official ideology of the Thai state is that Thailand is a country that has succeeded in bringing unity into the diversity of its many origins, and Pamahakan people have adopted this and said, this is who we are. Now you notice from the description that I have gone from talking about architecture simply on its own to talking about architecture with people in it. Or more than that, architecture that is being remade and reinterpreted by people who actually live there. And this is being done in opposition to an administration that, once again, without having any very intelligent plan, other than we've been told by higher authority we have to do this, is preparing to destroy this community without giving them a viable alternative, thereby probably creating greater social problems in terms of homelessness, in terms of the risk of getting exposed to drug and alcohol abuse and so on, breaking up families. Instead of that, what the authorities could do is to say, okay, you want to take on responsibility for looking after this place, this is what you would have to do in order to be allowed to do that. And I believe that the residents of Pamahakan would be able to do that. I give you this example knowing that in China there are many such cases, and there are others in Thailand as well. I have said repeatedly to the Thai authorities, and I'm repeating it now, of course, to anyone who will listen, that Pamahakan is a perfect example of a community that practices not just self-help, but also self-management. Instead of talking about development, which is a 19th century concept that should not be part of a 21st century vocabulary, and again I know that saying that in China is quite provocative, we should be talking, as the residents of Pamahakan do, about self-development, about bringing people together around the common task of making their community work. They have made it work. For 25 years they have now been a self-regulating community, united certainly in their opposition to the people who want to kick them out. So what does this tell us about the theme of vernacular architecture? Well, it tells us that any buildings, from the fortress, which is part of the original monumental structure of Bangkok, to these houses that I showed you just now, we are looking at people who are in a state of uncertainty about their future, but we are looking at people who are also giving meaning to the spaces in which they live. This is not the meaning of the bureaucrats who settled the community under Rama III about 200 years ago. This is a meaning in the 21st century of a group of people, part of whose history now is that opposition, that history of struggle with the authorities. But they are a community, not because somebody in office says, you are a community, or these people are not a community, but because they themselves have come together over the years and created a set of social relationships that have proved to be not just durable, but able to sustain a remarkable degree of cooperation. They have raised money together, very poor people. They've raised money together to build new houses, and also to send volunteers after the tsunami in 2004 to help the tsunami-stricken people in the south. They are people who have shown us the meaning of human dignity, and they will do it if they're driven out of the place as well. But I want to use this forum to say, not just to the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, but to any formal administration, that it is far better to preserve a way of life of which architecture is then an integral part, than to try to monumentalize bits of architecture and thereby largely deprive them of meaning. Yes, the meanings today are not those of yesterday, but they incorporate those of yesterday, and they echo forward to the future. That's the message that we've been looking at in this wonderful conference. And I hope that on this one occasion, by taking you outside of China, I have reminded you that the problems of dealing with the vernacular in China are analogous to the problems of dealing with the vernacular around the world. Thank you very much.